Good morning. Thank you for joining this webinar that Journalists for Human Rights is hosting this World Press Freedom Day, where we're directing attention to our work on fighting misinformation and disinformation worldwide, in particular against COVID-19. And we're also very, very honored this morning to be joined by the Honorable Karina Gould, Minister of International Development, who is joining us in part, I know, because she cares very passionately about this issue and has a particular interest in it and an understanding of the threat that misinformation and disinformation poses to media freedom on World Press Freedom Day. Welcome, Minister. It's a real honor to have you with us. Can you share with us a little bit of your thinking about why it's so important to focus attention on this kind of work this World Press Freedom Day?
Absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much, Rachel, for inviting me to participate in this webinar and for the work that Journalists for Human Rights do right around the world, and of course here in Canada as well. And I think particularly on World Press Freedom Day, it's important to highlight this work. We can look around the world and see the difficult circumstances in which journalists are trying to get accurate information out to their populations. And we know that journalism is key and integral to a well-functioning democracy. The fourth estate is important to holding leaders and governments and policymakers to account, in terms of delivering for their populations and for their citizens. And it's been a great pleasure to be able to work with and support the work of Journalists for Human Rights, particularly over the past year. Early on in the pandemic, one of the things that we recognized that was going to be so important was getting accurate information out to communities on COVID-19. And I remember participating in a webinar, I guess around maybe this time last year or a little bit later, with one of your phenomenal journalists who had done really important work in the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, right? And we know that, when it comes to getting information out, people turn to trusted sources. They turn to trusted members of their community so that they know that they're getting accurate and timely information. And the work that he was talking about and that he did in the Ebola outbreak in West Africa was so important to getting communities to understand what was happening, to help alleviate some of the fears, and to help ensure that best practices were being followed so that they could in turn respond, take on that public health guidance, and help bring down the caseload and the outbreak of Ebola in their own communities. And certainly, in the COVID-19 pandemic, one of the things that the WHO talks about is the infodemic. There's so much information out there, some of it good, but a lot of it bad or misleading or misinforming or even disinformation campaigns, specifically designed by nefarious actors to try and create confusion amongst populations. And so the fact that we were able to support the work of JHR to operate right around the world, in some places where they haven't even operated before, to train and work with journalists. And I want to recognize the fact that you've been able to pivot your operations to doing online training as well, has been really exciting to see. And hopefully this is something that, has served communities and citizens to access good, timely information during the pandemic, but that those skills, those capacities, those relationships that have been built over the past year will serve those communities moving into the future as well, both regards to, health information, but also in terms of them, being able to stand up for their rights, stand up for, democracy, and to further create inclusive societies. And so, I have a lot that I could say, but I think I'll probably, leave it there because I do recognize the truly, vital and important work that journalists do. especially in context where information can be hard to come by, where it might be difficult to ascertain what is correct, what is misleading, and to really parse through and to clarify and provide that accurate information to citizens. And we've absolutely seen the impact that the work that Journalists for Human Rights have done over the past year, how it's been meaningful and important for communities. And I think that today, on World Press Freedom Day in particular, it's important to recognize this work and to continue to support building out supportive ecosystems for media freedom, for those that are, seeking the truth, and to get that out to their citizens. So with that, thank you very much, Rachel, for having me. Thank you for leading the work at JHR. And thank you to all of those who are out there trying to discern what that accurate information is and getting it out to your communities and to the populations that you serve.
Thank you so much, Minister. It's a real honor to have you on with us. Very, very much appreciated that you could make the time. Thank you.
My pleasure.
Okay, and as the Minister underscored, this webinar is in part to draw attention to the 15-month Global Affairs Canada project that she worked with us to get off the ground, that we've been rolling out across 12 countries to fight the quote-unquote infodemic of mis and disinformation about COVID-19. And also to look at the human rights impact of COVID-19, in particular on women and girls. There have been some pretty extraordinary outcomes in that regard, including an epidemic of teen pregnancy in Kenya, and a number of other kinds of issues in terms of access to education that are of a scale that is hard for us sometimes in Canada to really comprehend. And this work is in part working to spotlight those issues and help the communities engage to find solutions to some of those problems, which is really, really valuable and important. The other piece that's been so exciting about this new project is it's represented a real innovation, as you mentioned, to JHR's standard approach to training. We've delivered the majority of the programming online, working both with some excellent Canadian trainers, but also well-networked local leadership. And what's been really interesting for me is that despite the fact that no head office staff flew to any of these places, and despite the fact that we don't actually have a physical office or presence on the ground in places like Yemen, Mauritania, or Iraq beyond our very well-networked coordinator, we've been able to see real traction when it comes to the training. And that tells me that there is a way to do this work that doesn't need to be as carbon intensive, for example, as having so many international folks fly around to these various spots. And that is very exciting for me because I think that it opens up opportunities to do much more nimble training on key thematic topics of concern, such as climate change, or doing training in environments that are too dangerous to send international trainers into, for example. And so that is also very, very exciting as sort of an unintended but very interesting consequence of this approach that COVID-19 forced us all into. So thank you so much, Minister. We're very, very grateful to you for coming on the show today, the webinar, and we're looking forward to unpacking more about the larger implications and threats that misinformation and disinformation poses to journalists this World Press Freedom Day, and also what are some things that we can all do to protect ourselves better from these kinds of problems. So thank you very much. And now it is my great honor to introduce the panelists for this morning. We have a superb lineup. And I'll start off with Craig Silverman. Craig is a Canadian journalist who has spent much of his career investigating how misinformation and disinformation distorts our collective understanding. He helped Journalists for Human Rights develop our first set of curriculum to train journalists on how to combat misinformation and disinformation in daily reporting, and is now working with us and First Draft News to roll that training out across a number of newsrooms across Canada, most recently, I believe, the Toronto Star. He is in the process of leaving, or no, has left a long-held role as media editor of BuzzFeed Canada to take up a new post with ProPublica, covering voting, platforms, disinformation, and online manipulation. And he is one of the world's foremost leading experts in disinformation, misinformation, and media manipulation. Our second panelist is Siyabulela Mandela. He is JHR's regional coordinator of the East South African region of the ongoing Mobilizing Media to Fight COVID-19 project supported by Global Affairs Canada. He's also a lecturer and a PhD candidate in the Department of Politics and Conflict Studies at Nelson Mandela University in South Africa. Siyabulela, who goes by his clan name Madiba, also led JHR's initial pivot in South Sudan, working with Global Affairs Canada support and with South Sudanese journalists to combat misinformation and disinformation about the pandemic there. Our third panelist is Sean McCarthy. He is the president of World Press Freedom Canada, an advocacy committee based in Ottawa that is dedicated to highlighting issues of press freedom in Canada and around the world. In that role, he has led efforts to convene press freedom lunch and award ceremonies. He's mounted panel discussions, sent urgent letters to the government, including this morning, which I think we may hear more about on the webinar today, and has participated in consultations with governments, UNESCO, and like-minded organizations on advancing press freedom. He also has a proud 40-year career in journalism, including when I first started in J School, you had the job I wanted, Sean, which was covering environment issues at the Globe and Mail. So it's a real honor for me to have you on this webinar today. And I'm looking forward to hearing more from all of you, but we're going to kick off with Craig, talking a little bit about the work that you have been doing both with us and in your life as a journalist on disinformation and misinformation.
Thank you, Rachel. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with my fellow panelists, and it's been really wonderful to be involved in this program with JHR. You know, as Rachel said, I've spent a long time in this area. Some people call me like the grandpa of covering this in journalism because, you know, the truth is that this wasn't a big focus in newsrooms. It wasn't a big focus among governments, among researchers, among a lot of the communities that have really mobilized over the last, say, 5 years or so. Back, and you know, I was thinking about moments in this kind of coverage. And actually about 10 years ago stands out to me when Hurricane Sandy hit the East Coast, mainly of the United States, didn't really have as much landfall in Canada. And when it hit New York in particular, we saw just a huge amount of false and misleading information spreading, in particular on Twitter, but some other platforms as well. Some of it was people intentionally making false claims about the New York Stock Exchange being flooded, but a lot of it was, photoshopped images of incredible sites and flooding that were, from years earlier from different places, and well-meaning people were spreading them. And in that moment, there was a lot of discussion about, is social media accelerating the spread of this kind of content, and what role does the media have? And some media outlets decided to try and debunk and guide people. But everybody just kind of let that sit after. And then, of course, a lot of time goes by and social media becomes so integrated into people's lives. And it really creates this very new information environment. And it's very new for journalists who are trying to do reporting, but it's very new also for members of the public. They have to navigate an information environment where, human tendencies and behavior are colliding with algorithms and ad tracking and manipulation, and all of this can happen on a global scale. And it's had obviously huge implications for the press. We've seen authoritarian leaders around the world use this technology and use the creation of fake accounts, the spreading of false and misleading information to win elections, to suppress dissent, and to also target independent and credible media and try to undermine them. And this is something that has happened around the world, in places close to home and in places far away. And we've had this awakening over the last 5 years or so, in part here in Canada, because we saw what was happening in the United States, but it wasn't just the US. I mean, it's been in Brazil, it's been in the Philippines, it's in many countries around the world. And today, in this area, we have very well-financed disinformation for hire professionals out there who describe themselves as, running PR firms or marketing firms, who you can hire to run campaigns, to troll people, to spread harm, to go after divisions that exist in different societies around the world. And so we see extremists and authoritarians and opportunists manipulating the public, undermining the press, and using this new information environment to do that. Now, it's not all negative. We have a much more democratized media environment. There are more voices that can come to the fore. But for people, especially those in racialized communities, people who are already marginalized in many cases, when they take advantage of this new environment, they are often met with harassment and they are targeted themselves. And so, in this environment, I think journalists have a huge amount of responsibility. One is, we are being targeted at times to undermine our role, but also to get us to be the conveyors of false and misleading information. Because if a journalist falls for something and passes it along, it takes on much more credibility. And so we are often targeted with campaigns to try and get us to unknowingly spread false or misleading information. We are often targeted to try and undermine our role, at the same time to elevate, other voices who aren't independent, who aren't doing factual reporting, but who are actually partisan and perhaps, hiding that. And so we have a real, responsibility in the work that we do every day, and in the work that we do for the public. And this topic, I think, has really, if we think about Sandy almost 10 years ago, and now the pandemic we've been going through, this is, another really key moment where I think everyone around the world has realized the power of false and misleading information, and how if you have the perfect situation like a pandemic with a new and unknown virus, where even experts were, didn't necessarily know all the details about it early on, were sometimes giving conflicting or advice that turned out to have to be changed, weeks or months later. It created the perfect situation, the perfect storm for so much mis and disinformation to spread and to have real world, real harm effects. And I think now so many people understand that more because of the personal nature and personal experience of the pandemic, which has truly been global. And so having a program like this, where we have curriculum created by great experts at First Draft, where we have Canadian journalists and also journalists from around the world who get trained on the curriculum and then can go out and train other journalists to kind of scale up and get as many people as possible to understand, for them, what responsible coverage looks like, to understand how to do digital investigations, to understand how to, verify images and video, and also understand the nature of, again, this information environment and how the pandemic has been warped and used to manipulate as a result of the dynamics of the environment. This kind of a program is really important. And for me, having spent more than a decade in this area, I still see a huge need within newsrooms, a huge training gap that exists. We have some specialists with high level skills, but the average newsroom, the average reporter does still not have a good grounding in, investigating this kind of stuff and understanding how to stop its spread and understanding how to equip and arm the public to inform themselves. And I think, we've made some great strides over the last few months with this program, and there's more work to be done. And I think on World Press Freedom Day, it's a great thing that is being rolled out, but we need even more of it, and we need more journalists to get these skills. And hopefully the pandemic has helped make the awareness among journalists, but also among the public, of how important press freedom is and how much we have to protect independent media and get them skilled up so that they can help inform the public about critical health and other kinds of topics.
I couldn't agree more. And I'm really happy that we're able to do this webinar today to underline the urgency and the importance of this in an environment where access to reliable information through a pandemic is literally a matter of life and death. And I think on this call, nobody is more acutely aware of the extent to which that might be the case than our next speaker, Madiba from South Africa, who had been working with us previously in South Sudan. And early on in South Sudan, we realized that we were going to need to pivot all of our resources towards fighting this scourge of myth, rumor, unverified information about how to protect yourself from this new disease. I remember that at one point there was a rumor circulating that tea could prevent COVID-19. And so there was this run on tea stalls in Juba with some violence involved. And Madiba, you stepped into that situation and helped to equip the journalists there in South Sudan with these skills and training in a country where there were 8 ventilators for 8 million people. So the stakes were very high. I'm wondering if you could speak a bit to that experience, and then subsequently about the work that you're currently doing with JHR in South Africa and other countries in the region.
Okay, thanks a lot, Edie, and to the rest of the panelists. Greetings to our friends and families who are also attending this webinar. And of course, Edie, the MMFC project came in towards the tail end of the JHR's most successful project in South Sudan, which was focused on strengthening media in that particular country. And of course, at the time I was in South Sudan, and we were also compelled, given the material conditions more global insofar as COVID-19 is concerned, we're more compelled to restructure our strengthening media in South Sudan project to incorporate the aspects of dealing with misinformation and disinformation as it relates to COVID-19. And of course, you can imagine in a country where media freedom is already something that is closer to non-existent and something that is very much problematic. And of course, journalists are finding it even difficult to report on very fairly easy issues, such as issues that relate to the violation of human rights in that particular country. So we had to, in South Sudan, we had to navigate a lot of challenges. For instance, I'll give some of those examples. We have a problem in South Sudan where, for one, when COVID-19 hit the country, there was a misconception that it was brought in South Sudan by white people. So our fellow counterparts from other humanitarian organizations operating in South Sudan, when they were walking in the street, the people would shout "Corona" because that's the information that has been spread out, that anyone that is white or of Caucasian descent, that is where the corona comes from. So you must run away from that. And also we started to witness a boom in the stigma. Firstly, there was a stigma towards anyone that would contract COVID-19, particularly our white counterparts within the humanitarian space. And also we witnessed a boom. Of course, South Sudan is a country influenced more by an Arab culture. So there's a lot of drinking of tea almost from the morning until the evening. Now we witnessed a boom in what we call tea stalls in South Sudan, where everyone was of the view that if you drink tea, particularly with lemon, COVID-19 is not going to affect you. And of course, the country is, insofar as climate is concerned, it's very hot. And there were misinformation such as saying, because of how hot South Sudan is, COVID-19 is going to melt as soon as it hits the surfaces in the country. So we had to deal with such issues from the grassroots level within the communities, and also to deal with the misinformation spread by the government itself, where if any member of government or a minister dies of COVID-19 related complication, the only messaging that will come from government is that they've succumbed to heart attack. And we started to see a lot of members of government dying of heart attack, which is something that became so prevalent from across the rest of other African countries. For instance, at the death of the Burundian president, it was heart attack. And of course, one that I'll speak into a bit later, the death of the Tanzanian president, it was also attributed to heart attack. So JHR had to deal with all those challenges and where to navigate. Of course, these were uncharted territories for most journalists, so we had to take them through on how to report first on issues that relate to COVID-19 or health-related issues more generally, and also how to combat and debunk mis and disinformation in that particular country. So those are some of the challenges that we're dealing with in South Sudan, and I hear some reports from our those who used to be JHR team in South Sudan, who are still waging the struggle against mis and disinformation, which is something, Edie, that I think can be attributed to JHR's ethos of working with local partners in order to have a lasting impact in our programming in different countries that we operate in, to an extent that even to this day, though the JHR project has ceased for a moment in South Sudan, hopefully it's going to be returning back now, the journalists trained by JHR are still continuing to wage a struggle against dis and misinformation in that particular country.
That's wonderful to hear, Madiba. And I know I got all sorts of rave reviews from our staff and our partners about the work that you in particular did and the positive energy that you generated through a very difficult time. So we're very, very grateful to you.
I think, ED, for just a second, a very important point that I missed. We also had to provide the PPEs for journalists there in South Sudan, because we found ourselves in a situation where journalists were refusing to go into the field and report on issues that relate to COVID-19 because of the stigma, and of course, because of the fact that they did not have the regalia, in this case, the PPEs, to protect themselves while they're continuing their journalism work. So JHR had to mobilize funding again, and we had to buy masks and distribute to almost all media outlets in South Sudan so that the journalists can be able to continue their fight against misinformation and disinformation as it relates to COVID-19 in that particular country.
Yes, that's also a very important point. And I know that you and the team went out to distribute masks and sanitizer and to ensure that people had the very basic equipment that they needed, as well as the skills provided by the training. So thank you very much, Madiba. Turning the attention to Sean McCarthy, you and I co-wrote an op-ed this morning in the Ottawa Citizen. The point of the exercise was to really direct attention on the urgency of this issue and how profoundly important it is for us all to wake up and be much more aware of the dangers of misinformation and disinformation, but particularly in regards to the threat that misinformation and disinformation poses to press freedom. You run a press freedom organization. Can you speak a little bit to why you've decided to focus so much on this now? And I know that this is also coming on the heels of a series of great podcasts that you put together on the issue. You know, why are you so seized with this particular issue now? What's the urgency?
Right. Thanks very much, Rachel. So our organization's been around for almost 25 years, and it grew out of Press Freedom Day and UNESCO's celebration of Press Freedom Day, and the need to focus on what I would call the sort of traditional concerns around press freedom, which is secrecy and censorship and intimidation, and making sure that journalists operate in as unconstrained an environment as possible. And we gave some awards today to a couple of journalists, Nathan Vandercliff from the Globe and Sarah Cox from the Narwhal, and both of them were very much in that world of battling secrecy and censorship. So, but as time went on, we became aware and more aware that the climate in which we're operating is very much affected by disinformation and misinformation, and that it has become a concern for press freedom. And I say that for a couple of reasons. One is, you know, the environment in which we work is so polluted with the sludge of disinformation and misinformation that trying to get actual facts out there can be very difficult. It has a big impact on trust of journalists. If journalists are challenging these tropes that you see on social media that often are very emotional, very closely held by the audience because it feeds their particular biases, which is part of the whole process on social media, using the algorithms and the AI to appeal to that kind of sensational, emotional content. It just becomes so much harder to operate as a journalist and to develop trust. It's already difficult to establish trust for the media and as journalists, and this flood of disinformation and misinformation on social media makes that harder. And finally, and Craig touched on this, but it's important to emphasize, it really feeds that attack on journalists, and it is more than coincidental that this increase in disinformation, in particular these disinformation campaigns launched by authoritarian governments and other hostile actors that then turn on the media and accuse them of false news, fake news. We've certainly heard that, and really turning the crowd, if you will, turning their supporters against journalists as as purveyors of messages that are critical of those leaders. I would say that's a problem, particularly, not exclusively. I mean, it's across the board. I mean, New York Times reporters in the United States face hostile crowds. So it's across the board, but it's particularly difficult for racialized journalists who might be subject to hate anyway on social media, and this just feeds that malevolence, really. So it really has become, in our view, a pressing issue around press freedom. So, you know, what do we do about it? And you and I, in our op-ed today, raised a few points. And you know, it's really important to have citizen literacy around these issues, and the education system needs to deal with it. Very important to train journalists, as you're doing, and kudos to all that work, but also for journalists to recognize the challenges that they face in building trust, and in the reporting of news. You know, sometimes I wish, I hesitate to say this out loud, but I will, you know, world press freedom and responsibility would be a nice addition to the title of the group, because, you know, it really is important for the journalists themselves to be responsible for accurate, fair coverage of the big issues. And that includes the legacy media, and it includes the startups and the independent media that is increasingly filling voids left by the shrinking newsrooms of the legacy media. And often, you know, when you're driven by subscriptions and you have an audience that exists in an echo chamber, it's really important I believe, for those publications to balance their reporting so that you give your readers a full view of the world that we're operating in. And this isn't, I'm not calling for some kind of false equivalency and, you know, including all sides, even when it's misinformation or disinformation, but fair, accurate, and to the degree that you can, balance reporting, I think, is really important to establish trust. And then finally, just a word on government action. You mentioned our podcast, which can be found on our website, worldpressfreedomcanada.ca. Canada Heritage responded to a question we asked about government role on disinformation. And basically it was buyer beware, you know, media literacy. We think there's probably more of a role for government. It has to be done very carefully. We're certainly not advocating censorship. And again, you and I made this point in the op-ed. But short of that, the social media platforms can be called to a greater level of responsibility. The business practices that they follow for generating revenue and profits should be transparent. There should be accountability for it. And if it's being driven by driving false information, misinformation, and disinformation, then they should be called to account on that. And I think there can be a role, not just for this civil society, but also for government in doing that. And finally, just you know, I appreciate the words of Minister Gould and her commitment on the international stage. It would be great to see the Liberal government do more domestically on its own account. You know, we're concerned about access to information laws that could be much more robust in terms of making accurate information available to journalists and civil society, so that we are combating misinformation with accurate information. Transparency, there's been a lot of criticism about the government for not being particularly transparent on some of their COVID policies. So again, great to see the government take up this challenge, but it would be, we would encourage them to walk the walk at home, in addition to talking the talk on the international stage. So I'll leave it at that.
Appreciate that, Sean. And your comments brought up several points that reminded me why we got going on this programming in the first place. Journalists for Human Rights is very fortunate to partner with Maria Ressa, the Filipina journalist who really started things off for me, alerting me to the issue of the sludge of misinformation and disinformation in the information ecosystem and the way in which that can be so easily manipulated online. Essentially, it's propaganda. But what she had found with Rappler, her organization in the Philippines, was that there were 25 social media accounts in the Philippines during the lead up to the 2016 election that were retweeting lies about the state of the country, the opposition, basically the propaganda messages of the party that eventually won power, the Rodrigo Duterte administration, at a rate of millions of times a minute. And Maria says, you know, a lie repeated a million times becomes the truth. And that is the challenge that we face. And Craig, you'd mentioned the extra responsibility that journalists hold in this context, where if a journalist picks up a false narrative about, for example, Hunter Biden's laptops and starts, you know, amplifying and giving credibility to that, that then becomes the news cycle. And a lot of journalists, I think, just aren't aware, because this is all so new. They're just not aware of how to ensure that they report on a lying politician, but they don't quote that lying politician verbatim, for example. And I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit to the work that you're going to be doing with ProPublica and why, you know, why they created this role and how, where you see the focus of this work moving forward for you.
Yeah, you know, my first day there is a week from today, so I have a bit of a reprieve between the two roles. But you know, one of the things that really interests me about ProPublica, I mean, it's a newsroom that's dedicated to investigative journalism. That is what they do. And I still think there is a huge amount of work that needs to be done investigating, you know, these big technology platforms, holding them accountable. They are some of the most powerful entities in the world, if you really think about their global reach and the fact that in some countries, you know, for the way Facebook, for example, is in some countries, people think Facebook is the internet. You know, they get a cheap mobile smartphone. It comes with a version of Facebook preloaded on it. It is free for them to use Facebook, but it costs them to use bandwidth for other kinds of things. And so it becomes part of the infrastructure of these countries. And so investigating, you know, for example, the inequality of the investment of resources from companies like Facebook in places like Western Europe, North America, versus what they're doing in certain parts of Asia and in, you know, most of countries in Africa. I think Facebook is pretty understaffed in terms of moderation and oversight. And so I think those are all important areas. And with ProPublica, also one of the things that they've been doing over the last year or two is building out these kind of local investigative units in different parts of the United States, in particular in places where local media, you know, over time, because of the business model starting to really suffer, and other factors where they've really lost that local accountability journalism. And frankly, I think we see that happening in Canada as well. It's happening in other parts of the world. And so one of the things I'm going to be doing is working with these local investigative units in the Midwest, in the South, in the Southwest, training them on some of the ability to kind of monitor and track and report on mis and disinformation. And we're hoping that, you know, between elections, we actually are able to combine the on-the-ground presence with some of that sort of digital monitoring and digital skills to really get a sense of, you know, the narratives, the players. You know, are there sort of local disinformation agents? Are there issues where there is a lot of, you know, misinformation spreading, and can we actually be there ahead of time? And I think that's one of the challenges always with the press, right? Is that we tend to come in and flood the zone during an election when there's an issue, and what happens in between? And so for me, one of the interesting things is if we have these journalists who are there locally, how can we equip them with, frankly, you know, some of the knowledge and skills that has been part of this program we've been doing with JHR, so that they can sort of take that digital pulse, be there, understand the narratives, understand the movements in real life, in the digital realm, and hopefully, you know, have a good sense of what's going on long before people are going out and voting, and long before any bad actors can actually sort of take root and start to plan and really start to build a movement there.
Yeah, no, it's almost part of building up a sense of civic resilience against the spreading of false narratives. Absolutely. And full disclosure, JHR is looking at a possible program in the United States in order to address this issue, because this is truly a global problem and it requires a global solution. Thanks, Sean, for raising the question about access to information. All of us on the call who've been Canadian journalists have received those crazy packages with, like, pretty much, well, everything redacted. So I do hope that we see some movement on access to information here at home. But part of the goal here with this conversation is focusing on the completely crazy circumstances that some journalists work with and face internationally. Right now I'm thinking of Tanzania, and I'm thinking of journalists trying to cover COVID-19 in an environment where you're not allowed to use the phrase COVID-19 up until very recently. And I'm wondering, Madiba, if you can speak to the particular challenges that journalists face fighting misinformation and disinformation in quasi-authoritarian environments where the government is actually part of the problem in a very meaningful way. If you could speak to that, that'd be great.
No, well, thanks a lot, Edie. But I think before I speak into that, Edie, it's very important to provide more context into the MMFC project that Journalists for Human Rights has been doing in different parts of the African continent, but speaking particularly on Southern and East and Southern Africa region, that is to say, in the case of the MMFC project, that is Tanzania, Uganda, and South Africa. I think that it's very important to recognize the contextual differences that exist within those countries. And in our programming as JHR, we're always compelled to adapt and be flexible according to the context that we operate in. For instance, when it comes to Tanzania, we are dealing, at least under John Magufuli's administration, we're dealing with a quasi-authoritarian regime, which means that there is so much of a censorship insofar as media is concerned. To give just an example behind this is to say, for instance, insofar as Tanzania is concerned, we all know that Tanzania has adopted a denial stance insofar as COVID-19 is concerned, such that when I was on the ground during the training in Tanzania, the message, the information that I received from journalists during those trainings was that in the beginning of COVID-19, all journalists were called under one roof by the government, and they were instructed not to report on anything related to COVID-19. As a matter of fact, they were even advised that they had to, if anything has to do with, if there is a death that is related to COVID-19, it has to be coined around lines of someone has died because of flu or influenza and all other funny diseases, but not COVID-19. As a result, there are certain media outlets that were shut down by government that refused to toe the line as given by the government. And also we had to, during our programming in Tanzania, we had to find strategies in which we can still continue our MMFC programming, mobilizing the media to fight COVID-19 in the country, and also to report on COVID-19 related issues in Tanzania. So we came across variants, we deliberated on various strategies and tactics on how to evade the impact of reporting on COVID-related issues in Tanzania, as to say, for instance, certain article that speaks into COVID-19 directly and its impact in the country will be, though written by the journalists in Tanzania, they will be published in Kenya and published in Uganda and then exported as though they're coming from outside the country, so as to protect the journalists who are writing those particular stories. And of course, in Uganda, we're dealing with a pseudo-democratic states, and the challenges that come with that are completely different to that of Uganda, to that of Tanzania, I mean. So in Uganda, for instance, though the journalists are allowed to report on COVID-related issues, but they cannot say anything that is against the government while they are reporting on such issues, to an extent that oftentimes journalists we had to navigate away, because within our MMFC programming, we not only focus on COVID, but we also focus on the impact of COVID on human rights. And in Tanzania, in Uganda, in this case, there are certain communities which do not enjoy rights as the rest of the Ugandan, such as the LGBTQI community, where they are not allowed to exist in that particular country, such that we have to, if we're writing about stories relating to the impact of COVID-19 on gays and lesbians, we cannot write such. So we have to be very creative, such as vulnerable groups, for instance. We can't say gays, we can't write about lesbians in Uganda because it is against the laws of the country to write about such issues. So, and so there's quite a lot of challenges that we were facing there. And in South Africa, it's a different context. There is a degree of media freedom, there's a degree of freedom of speech, but we had to deal with a lot of challenges, such as in that country, a lot of issues that relates to human rights violation as it pertains to COVID-19. We notice a rise in gender-based violence. And already in South Africa, gender-based violence was already a crisis. For instance, to give an example, in the past 3 months, from October, November, December, over 12,200 women have been raped in the country as a result of the lockdown that came due to COVID-19. And that is the statistics released by the Minister of Police in the country. So those are some of the contextual differences that we're dealing with. And they are even worse when it comes to Tanzania. We're hoping that post John Magufuli's administration, the new administration will be much more lenient towards journalists, and they'll be allowed to write about COVID-19 stories. I'm very happy to report, Edie, that we have one successful story on COVID-19, huge headlines on COVID-19 impact in Tanzania, already published in the country. So I suppose it speaks into how the new administration is now adopting an eased approach insofar as dealing with COVID-19 in that particular country. And also, I'm very happy to report that we have trained over 65 journalists in all 3 countries thus far, and 75% of those are female journalists. And that is very important from our MMFC project, because if you are looking at the impact of COVID-19 on issues of human rights, the rights of women and girls are more affected as compared to the rest of the population. For instance, if you're looking at Uganda, similar to what is happening in Kenya, where the rise in teenage pregnancy during COVID-19, in South Africa, a rise in gender-based violence. And the reporting that comes from female journalists is of critical importance as we wage a struggle and mobilizing media to fight COVID-19, and also to fight, to report on the impact of COVID-19 on human rights more generally.
Thank you so much, Madiba. We're now getting some questions from the audience, and we've got about 12 minutes left. One of the first question I think is best sent to Craig. And the question is, how can we best fight misinformation and disinformation on the COVID-19 vaccine? How do we address the questions and the issues that anti-vaxxers have to some extent created for the vaccine rollout effort?
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously a really important moment, as I think this is the month where Canada is probably receiving the most vaccines we've ever received so far. You know, one thing to understand is obviously, you know, anti-vaxxers have not just come out of nowhere. This is a community that has been building and growing for quite some time and has been actually very effective at organizing and kind of pulling people into it online. And I think, you know, one thing for the individual person to think about is that for a lot of people, let's say it's, you know, someone you know, a friend, a family member who's maybe got some hesitancy, you know, oftentimes anti-vax origins they come from parents who are concerned about the well-being of their children. It can come from a good place of saying, you know, is this safe? I want to protect my children. And of course, then people start to feed upon that question and that fear. And so it's similar with these vaccines. You know, I know people who have said, well, you know, maybe I'll wait. I don't want to get the AstraZeneca. Maybe I'll just hold off. And you know, there's the one side of it where not pressuring people, but also just saying to them, you know, it's been shown that if you do get fully vaccinated with whether it's AstraZeneca or any other, it's almost 100% protection against hospitalization, which is, a really big thing. But also, you can point to around the world and saying that where they've been doing the single dose of AstraZeneca in the UK, cases are way down, deaths are way down, they're reopening. And you can see, because Canada's a little bit behind the US and the UK, that they are having tremendous results with it. And then I think it's also understanding a person's individual hesitancy. So again, if it's you dealing with someone dealing with empathy and listening, what is the nature of their hesitancy? What is the nature of their resistance? What you don't want to do in these kinds of cases is make people feel stupid, make them feel like they're anti-science. You don't want to attack them. You want to, debunk the ideas. You want to debunk any falsehoods. You don't necessarily want to attack or debunk the person. And then beyond that, I think, it's really helpful to see political leaders and other leaders in Canadian society going out, getting vaccinated, taking photos of that, having clear communication about the vaccines, not reducing any of the the risk factors or other things that are out there, but communicating about them responsibly and in the context of risk of there are things we do every day that are far more risky than getting one of these vaccines, for example. And so I think that public health messaging, people continuing to take those selfies, to continue to create sort of that communal sense that this is safe. And then if it's people in your individual life, really thinking about, empathizing with them and understanding their concern. And of course, beyond that, I think the platforms themselves, Facebook and others, have taken strong stances where it's, anti-vaccine falsehoods and claims. They are trying to remove those quickly. So if you do see false claims, you can report them to various platforms and they will usually be removed. And if you are seeing people out there who are, making money by spreading this kind of stuff or seem to be kind of organizing around it, that is the kind of thing that news organizations might be interested in looking at or covering. So that's an option as well.
Thanks, Craig. That's great. In terms of second question, a member of the audience is interested to hear panelists' views on quote unquote regulation of the profession. And recently, for example, I discovered that pilots have to take re-regulating, re-upping of their skills every 6 months. The people who fly planes to ferry us from A to B. When I was a journalist, I was never required to take any form of skills development at all. And considering the responsibility I held in the way that in how many people my reporting reached and the way that it shaped their perceptions of events, I find that an interesting question to contemplate. And I'm wondering maybe, Sean, if you have some further thoughts in terms of how best we could go about this and maybe expound on one or two of the points in the op-ed.
Sure. I'm not sure I would go down the road of regulating the profession. Frankly, the question of who is a journalist these days is actually a bit of a vexing one, even for the media themselves. With the rise of citizen journalists and polemicists and all you need is access to the internet to be a journalist. So that is both very opening and democratic, if you will, but also challenging, and particularly in terms of disinformation and misinformation. I do think that that the media companies in general, the publications, perhaps could be more aggressive in putting forward their codes of conduct, codes of ethics, making sure that when people have complaints, they are dealt with. Everybody has one of the requirements to get into the press gallery, for example, and there are some areas where media are regulated just in the sense of having access that way, is that you have to have a code of conduct and a code of standards that you have to commit to fair and accurate coverage and so on. So I think that we could do more in terms of putting that making that more of a focus and providing avenues for people to complain and address issues. But I worry always about getting government too deeply involved if it was a government kind of regulation that was being proposed. We already see concerns around financial support for media that is having so much trouble in even before COVID it was, and with COVID even more so. And there are people who are very distrustful when government provides some kind of economic support for media, that somehow taints the coverage. So again, trust in media is a big challenge. I just saw a Harvard study of young people in the United States where the media, which is in my view, a difficult phrase, ranks right down there with Facebook and Twitter in terms of trust. So I recognize that the question comes from a place of wanting to build trust, in fact, but I'm not sure that would be an answer.
I think, to be clear, the questioner was talking about self-regulating bodies and strategies such as, for example, Journalists for Human Rights is supporting Reporters Without Borders Journalism Trust Initiative, which is about media partners self-assessing along a series of objective criteria of what it means to be an independent media organization. And then that process can be accredited by a third-party accreditation body such as Deloitte, making sure that they're doing, that they're abiding by their codes of conduct, but in a self-regulated way, rather than a scenario where government is in any way involved, which of course would be hugely problematic.
Well, and there are press councils, and there are self-regulating bodies that are in place that, again, I'm not disagreeing that more effort and more focus shouldn't be put in this area, and so I think that there are some bodies available that could be used in this regard. Yeah.
Okay, last question from the audience, and this one's going to Madiba in South Africa. It's an audience member from the United States, and he's just curious to understand how the rest of the world views the disinformation, misinformation problem in the United States, and some of the whipping up of sentiment, for example, around QAnon and conspiracy theories that ultimately spilled over into the Jan 6 violence in the Capitol. What's the global perception of what's going on in the US when it comes to this issue? You're on mute, you're on mute.
It's very difficult for me, ED, to respond to that particular question because, for one, I'm one that is already very critical of the United States more generally, and particularly its politics in the African continent. I'm one that moves from that comes from a decolonial school. That is to say, I am against anything that has to deal with the African continent being over-reliant on the West, particularly the United States. And we've seen the distraction that the US has caused in African politics. That is, of course, not to absolve the African leaders for the challenges that and the problems that they are creating for their own people within the continent. So anything that happens in the US, it's not something for me that I'm very interested on particular because of my stance and my perspective on the US foreign policy in relation to the African continent, and one that is always very critical of the US. So anything that I say will be biased towards or even against the US. I wouldn't even agree to anything that the US is doing. It has caused so much chaos for us in the African continent, and I don't even want to indulge into what the American politics are, because they're already mingling so much with our African politics to begin with.
That's a very adroit answer and an important one. I think it's important for American audiences to understand the extent to which their behavior in the African continent in particular has been problematic. Maybe Craig, very briefly in the last minute or so, you could speak to that question about how globally mis and disinformation in the US is viewed.
Well, I think for a little while there, people around the world were some people were amazed to see how quickly it was starting to sort of take hold and destabilize the US. But I think there were also a lot of people in different countries around the world who looked at it. And, there's been this idea of American exceptionalism that, things that affect other countries and other parts of the world, America and Americans don't really experience them. And if you were to talk to people who have been living under authoritarian regimes, or in places, as Mandiva said, that where American foreign policy has really interfered and caused huge problems. I mean, for them, they looked at it and they said, anyone is vulnerable. There is no American exceptionalism. When you have, a leader who has the huge megaphone and who is uniting and exciting extremists, and also America's, racist history also being kind of ignited in this moment. I think a lot of people sort of saw, for some it was, see, the American exceptionalism has in some ways contributed to this and is not what it has sort of been led to believe. And I think for others, there was a point of frustration in that, this countries around the world have been experiencing this, whether it's the Philippines, Myanmar, Brazil, other places had been experiencing this long before the US. And there was frustration that, suddenly the US is having issues with the spread of false misleading information and now everybody cares, right? And so I think there was some element of that. And then there's also a certain amount of relief that, okay, because something happened in the United States, suddenly the platforms are taking it seriously. Suddenly governments around the world are taking it seriously. And suddenly, funders around the world are taking it seriously. And so, there's a mix of reactions and perception about it. It certainly has had a huge effect, that the fact that the United States experiences stuff like my cat is visiting me. The kids stayed upstairs, but the cat didn't, because the United States has been affected by this. Suddenly, governments around the world, and particularly those, allied with the United States, are waking up too. And so it's had a global effect. And the attitude, varies from country to country.
I think that's
Rachel, can I just add, I think Maria Reyes made the point very eloquently that what happened in the Philippines was not limited to that this was a test run, and that, these practices around disinformation. And then we should add that this disinformation in the Philippines then led to attacks on her. And just what we were talking about earlier, how disinformation then leads to attacks on the journalists and legal attacks, and so it's a global problem, but also one that the actors are global as well. We're not looking at a pocket of, the practices migrate.
And on that note, I would like to drive everyone's attention this World Press Freedom Day to the global campaign that RSF is running to draw attention in particular to the challenges that Maria Ressa has faced as a result of raising the alarm about misinformation and disinformation. She's now facing more than 9 counts of cyber libel in the Philippines, which is a charge that potentially carries with it both jail time and massive fines. And these charges, by all objective measures, are bunk. And so calling on governments, including our own, to denounce these charges because they are problematic. And she is one of our most important voices. With all respect to Madiba on the call, she is to some extent our era's Mandela in terms of focusing attention on a global problem that threatens us all, and so wanting to direct attention to her campaign and to hashtag hold the line. Thank you so much, everyone on the call. We're slightly over now, but there's so much more that we could say about this issue. Greatly appreciated everyone stepping up and being part of and lending your brains and expertise to this urgently important question. And for those watching, please start to pay a bit more attention to efforts to fight misinformation and disinformation, but also fact-checking information that comes across your social media feed. You can do a very simple reverse image search, for example, on Google to check and see if a photograph is actually illustrating the article that it accompanies. There are ways to protect yourself and not share false information in ways that help protect us all. So thank you very, very much, everyone, and happy World Press Freedom Day.